But this is really worth something. This is something people want. When people see for themselves, I don't have to convince them it's a good investment.
Behind the fame of Pawn Stars Rick Harrison lies a hidden tragedy few fans know. His wife's heartbreaking story reveals pain, sacrifice, and struggles that shattered their seemingly perfect life. Rick Harrison has been a household name for years because of the phenomenal success of Pawn Stars. The show turned him into a cultural figure, admired for his sharp business sense, humor, and charisma. Millions of people tuned in weekly to watch him negotiate deals, share stories about antiques, and display his encyclopedic knowledge of history and collectibles. But away from the cameras, the lights, and the fortune that came with worldwide recognition, a very different story unfolded in his personal life. At the center of that story was his wife, whose heartbreaking tragedy left a scar that Rick himself has rarely spoken about. When people think of Rick Harrison, they picture the bustling shop in Las Vegas, the unforgettable characters like Chumlee and Corey, and the constant parade of treasures. Rarely do fans ask what toll fame, money, and endless public attention can take on a person's private life. For Rick, the reality of marriage, family, and personal relationships was far from glamorous, and for his wife, it was often devastating. To understand what happened, it is important to look at Rick's journey as both a businessman and a husband. Rick has been married more than once, and each marriage brought its own challenges. His wives were deeply connected to his fame, yet painfully separate from it. While Rick became the face of one of the most successful reality shows in history, his wives were often the silent figures in the background. Among them, one story stands out because it was not only about heartbreak but about tragedy. The weight of reality television fame is not only about cameras following you around. It brings constant judgment, endless rumors, and harsh speculation. For Rick's wife, it meant living in the shadow of someone else's fame while carrying her own private struggles. Imagine trying to live a normal life while strangers dissect your marriage, comment on your appearance, and speculate about your choices. For her, this was not just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. But her tragedy went deeper than media attention. It was rooted in health challenges, financial strain, and emotional battles. Reports suggest she dealt with struggles no one would wish on another person. From illness to the breakdown of her marriage, each step was painful and at times very public. Friends and family have said that Rick's wife tried to remain strong, supportive, and determined to hold everything together. She wanted her family intact and her life stable. But sometimes even the strongest hearts cannot withstand pressure. Slowly, the burden grew too heavy. Rick himself has admitted in interviews that balancing his work and personal life was nearly impossible. The pawn business was demanding on its own. Once Pawn Stars became a global success, his life was consumed by filming, running the shop, promotional tours, interviews, and appearances. Home life became secondary. His wife often had to manage everything alone while also coping with the emotional absence of her husband. That absence created strain. Strain turned into arguments. Arguments grew into distance. And over time, the cracks in their marriage widened. Friends of the couple revealed that tension was constant, and the once loving bond began to fade. The deepest part of the tragedy came when Rick's wife began facing personal battles beyond the marriage itself. Accounts suggest she struggled with both physical and emotional health. Illness, depression, and the pressure of public life drove her toward despair. And despair affects not only one person, but the entire family. To make matters worse, these struggles unfolded under the glare of the public eye. Every rumor became a headline. Every whisper turned into gossip. Their personal grief was treated like entertainment. For fans who only saw Rick smiling on television, this was unthinkable. Behind that smile was a man torn between professional success and personal heartbreak. His wife's tragedy was not only about the end of a marriage. It was about how fame, stress, and health struggles combined to create a storm few families could endure. As time passed, Rick's wife became more withdrawn. She avoided public appearances and distanced herself from the spotlight Rick thrived in. Rumors circulated, but the truth remained hidden. Some said she could not handle the fame. Others believed her health was failing. Those closest to her described her as quietly suffering, carrying pain that no one could see. Rick himself faced a painful choice. On one hand, he wanted to continue building his empire. On the other, he wanted to be present at home. But he could not be in both places at once. His absence, no matter how unintentional, was felt deeply, and it contributed to the heartbreaking path their marriage eventually took. At its core, this tragedy was not about reality television or money. It was about two people who once loved each other but were pulled apart by forces greater than them both. Rick was the public face of success, but his wife bore the silent burden of a crumbling personal world. Fans often wonder why Rick rarely speaks about this chapter of his life. The answer may be simple. Some wounds are too raw to share. Rick built a public image of strength, confidence, and humor. But behind that image was a man who lived through heartbreak, and behind him was a woman whose tragedy left permanent marks. The story of Rick Harrison's wife is not just about her personal pain. It reveals a larger truth about fame. Success may bring wealth, recognition, and status, but it cannot protect anyone from illness, despair, or the breaking of a family bond. Rick's wife became an example of how fame magnifies personal struggles, how difficult it is to live in another person's shadow, and how fragile relationships can become under relentless pressure. The tragedy surrounding Rick Harrison's wife did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, like a storm building in the distance, until the winds of stress, pressure, and personal struggles became overwhelming. To the outside world, Rick seemed untouchable. He was the savvy businessman who turned a small pawn shop into a Las Vegas landmark and a television empire. But those closest to him knew that his family life was crumbling, piece by piece. The heart of this tragedy lies in the conflict between public image and private reality. Fans adored Rick for his confidence, humor, and sharp eye for valuable items. But behind closed doors, his wife lived in an entirely different world. She faced loneliness, emotional distance, and the suffocating shadow of constant public attention. It was like living in two separate realities, and sooner or later, those realities collided. The real question many people ask is this: what exactly happened to Rick Harrison's wife? The answer cannot be summed up in a single word like divorce or illness. It was a combination of factors that fed into each other, creating an emotional chain reaction. One of the most painful aspects was her health. Reports suggest she struggled with physical ailments that limited her ability to live freely and fully. Health issues are difficult enough for anyone to manage, but when paired with emotional struggles and the weight of fame, they can become devastating. Depression is another factor often mentioned by those close to the couple. The quiet pain of depression rarely shows itself in public, but behind the scenes, it can drain every ounce of energy, joy, and hope. At the same time, their marriage faced financial and emotional strains. While Rick built an empire, there were whispers that not all aspects of their personal finances were secure. Reality television pays well, but it also demands enormous time and energy, often at the expense of relationships. His wife felt that loss every day. She carried the silence of dinners without him, weekends spent alone, and nights where the cameras and contracts seemed to matter more than their bond. It is important to remember that Rick's wife did not marry a celebrity. She married a man who once ran a small pawn shop in Las Vegas, long before the cameras arrived. Fame changed everything. Suddenly, their private life became public property. Arguments became headlines, and speculation about their marriage spread across the internet. That constant intrusion chipped away at her sense of stability. Those close to the family recall moments where Rick's wife felt invisible. While fans lined up outside the gold and silver pawn shop to meet Rick, she remained at home, struggling with her own battles. The imbalance of visibility and importance was crushing. She did not want fame, yet she became trapped by it. She was the wife of a television star, but in her own eyes, she was disappearing into the background. This feeling of invisibility only deepened as her health declined. Friends describe her as withdrawing from social events, avoiding the spotlight, and eventually retreating almost entirely from public life. For fans, her absence was noticeable, but very few understood why. Some assumed she simply disliked fame. Others speculated about marital problems. The truth was far more heartbreaking. She was struggling with issues so heavy that stepping out in public felt impossible. Meanwhile, Rick tried to manage both worlds. He wanted to keep his show thriving while also protecting his family. But reality television is not forgiving. Producers demand long filming schedules, fans expect constant availability, and the business side of the pawn shop requires daily attention. His wife, left to carry her pain in silence, began to crumble under the weight of it all. The tragedy eventually reached a breaking point. Their marriage could not survive the combined impact of health struggles, emotional distance, and public scrutiny. Divorce papers were filed, and their relationship ended. For many couples, divorce is painful but private. For Rick and his wife, it became yet another headline. The world discussed their personal lives as if it were entertainment, forgetting that behind the gossip were real people, real heartbreak, and real suffering. The end of their marriage was not the end of her struggles. After the divorce, Rick's wife faced even more challenges on her own. Friends say she never fully recovered from the emotional wounds she carried. She had lost her marriage, her health was fragile, and her sense of self had been shaken to the core. It was during this period that her life became defined not by what she gained, but by what she lost. The most tragic element of her story is that her pain never truly went away. Despite attempts to rebuild, her life remained haunted by the years of pressure, loneliness, and heartbreak. While Rick moved forward with his career and public life, she was left with the invisible scars of their past. For many people, her story is a reminder that not all tragedies are visible. Some live quietly, in the shadows, away from cameras and headlines. Rick himself rarely speaks about this chapter, but those who know him say he carries the weight of regret. He is proud of what he built with Pawn Stars, but he understands the cost it had on his family. The tragedy of his wife is not just her story, it is his as well. It is the story of a man who gained the world but lost the stability of his marriage, and the story of a woman who gave everything but received little in return. As fans, it is easy to separate the star from the human being. We see Rick Harrison as a successful television personality, but we forget he is also a man who has felt the same heartbreak and loss as anyone else. His wife's tragedy reveals the human side of fame, the side that reality shows never display. There is another layer to this tragedy that makes it even more heartbreaking. Rick's wife did not only struggle with personal pain, she also had to witness her struggles being twisted into public narratives. Rumors about her health, her character, and her marriage spread freely. Strangers speculated about her as if she were a character in a soap opera. That kind of public dissection can destroy even the strongest person's spirit. And so the question remains, what do we learn from this story? The tragedy of Rick Harrison's wife teaches us that fame does not shield anyone from suffering. Money and success cannot heal a broken heart or cure deep emotional pain. Relationships require presence, understanding, and love, none of which can be replaced by television contracts or fan adoration. In the years since, Rick has continued to run his business and appear on Pawn Stars. But for those who know his story, there is always an awareness that behind his public success lies a private heartbreak. His wife's tragedy is part of his history, shaping him into the man he is today. For the fans who loved Rick Harrison for his humor and sharpness, it may be difficult to connect that image with the reality of his wife's suffering, but both are true. The man who could turn a rusty item into a profitable sale is also the man who endured the collapse of his marriage and the pain of watching his wife suffer. This duality is what makes Rick Harrison's story so powerful. It reminds us that celebrities are not immune to tragedy. They may live in the spotlight, but they also face the same struggles of health, love, and heartbreak as anyone else. The difference is that their struggles are magnified by fame. As viewers, we should remember that the people we watch on television are real, with families, spouses, and private lives. Behind the laughter and entertainment can be stories of unimaginable pain. Rick Harrison's wife lived such a story, and it is one worth remembering, not as gossip, but as a lesson about humanity. Her tragedy is not simply about the collapse of a marriage. It is about the loneliness that comes from being overshadowed, the pain of dealing with health struggles in silence, and the cruelty of having your life picked apart by strangers. It is about the hidden side of fame, the part no one sees. Rick Harrison will always be remembered for his role in Pawn Stars, but the legacy of his wife's tragedy is a quieter, more sobering reminder of what fame can cost. It shows us that behind every television personality is a family, and behind every smile is a story we may never fully know. As Rick moves forward with his life, the memory of his wife's pain remains. It is part of his journey, part of the price of fame, and part of the story that will always follow him. For his wife, the tragedy of her struggles may never be fully understood by the public, but those who knew her best remember the strength she showed in the face of overwhelming pressure. Their story is both heartbreaking and cautionary. It reminds us to look beyond the surface, to recognize the human beings behind the headlines, and to understand that success often comes with unseen costs. The tragedy of Rick Harrison's wife is a powerful reminder that behind every reality star, behind every public figure, lies a private life filled with joys and sorrows just like ours. If you found this story eye-opening, support our channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Stay tuned for more untold stories behind fame, where hidden truths reveal the deepest human struggles.